From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
What do we want?
Climate justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Climate justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
The climate change crisis is at a boiling point, almost literally.
No more blah, blah, blah. No more blah, blah, blah.
Is the fate of the world about to be decided in Glasgow? COP26, the United Nations-led conference of the parties, finds the heads of state of almost every nation in the world meeting right now in Glasgow with the aim of halting climate change. Past climate summits like Kyoto in 1992 and Paris in 2015 were seen as important steps in recognizing the existential threat that is climate change.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
But the consensus is that none of those supposedly big moments have dealt with the climate crisis in a real way. Emissions are at an all-time high. The UN's latest report on climate change shows the world is headed to a warming of 2.7 degrees, a huge distance away from the goal of the 1.5 degree increase being talked about at COP26. So how is this time any different? Will the world's leaders finally back up their words with policies to tackle climate change? And what is Canada committing to? We're talking to Heather Scoffield, Ottawa bureau chief and economics columnist for the Toronto Star. Heather joins us from Glasgow, where she's reporting from inside the convention center of COP26, amongst the world's leaders and climate activists. Heather, hello to you in Scotland. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
This is one of the biggest and most important international summits in recent memory. Can you set the scene for us? What is it like outside on the streets of Glasgow, and what is it like when you're inside the conference center?
Well, it's my second day here, and the first day in particular was pandemonium outside. I mean, the weather was terrible and, stiff wind blowing, and there were crowds and crowds of people trying to get into the conference center here where they're having a summit. So the leaders are in town for 2 days, and then they hand their talks over to officials who continue on for another 10 days. But the first 2 days are particularly intense. So it was chaotic. I mean, first of all, there are tens of thousands of people that have come to Glasgow for this summit. And, they're booking up every hotel. They're crowding in on the trains. They're having trouble finding their way around. And on top of that, there's been a garbage strike and local neighborhoods complaining about rat infestations and upset with the city and the municipality for how they take care of things. So there's just this general level of chaos, but also I would say, a bit of a carnival atmosphere among some of the people who are here too. I mean, there's a common goal, of course, that everybody wants to fix the planet and, fix climate change. It's a matter of level of ambition and making concrete commitments, but just that commonality of wanting to make things better for the planet means that everybody's kind of out there. People who are marching and people who are negotiating kind of are all very concerned about the environment. So there's an underpinning of commonality.
Of course, we've seen some climate activists. Of course, Greta Thunberg is out there. Many people, it seems like, are out in the streets, even if they haven't been officially invited inside the conference center.
Right. So I'm inside the conference, and it's kind of hard to go back and forth because there's some pretty stiff security. And there's some complaints among people on the street for not to have as much access as they'd like to leaders. But, even inside the walls of the summit site, there are quite a lot of activists. There's certainly a very big range of diverse voices. There's almost 200 different countries here, most of them represented, at least right now, by their leaders or heads of state. And then there are also a whole bunch of journalists, of course, but different organizations that have accreditation as well. So a lot of environmental groups, companies, cultural groups. There is a lot of representation across the board, I would say, within the walls of the conference. So it's a very vibrant atmosphere. Even if inside the summit, it's not a protest site by any means, it's still a very vibrant conversation.
The question that many listeners will be asking off the bat is, how is COP26 different from other climate change summits? We've seen international meetings like this before. Why is this one being billed as the quote-unquote last best chance to tackle climate change in a real way?
I think there is a pretty big consensus that if this summit fails, that climate change and emissions will have a tough time going forward. So there's a feeling of urgency in the air. The leaders meet every 5 years through this process run by the UN. And so this is their 5th year anniversary to have a meeting, except it's 6 years because of COVID. So everybody's been on the edge of their seat waiting to see what the leaders would do when they would meet. And that kind of gives the whole ongoing process about how to solve climate change internationally, it gives it a big boost. But what it also means is, we have some pretty big confrontations going on at a diplomatic level. The United States, the election of Joe Biden was pretty interesting for the whole climate diplomacy scene, because obviously Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the previous agreement that came from the last time we had leaders at COP, which was in Paris. So, we always talk about the Paris Agreement.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Trump pulled the United States out of Paris. Biden put the United States back in, and he was expected to come here this week with, a very big climate package. He ran on that and won an election on his dedication to fighting climate change. But now his whole package has been gummed up in Congress. And so he's kind of empty-handed. He has a lot of goodwill, but nothing concrete that he's delivering here this week. And then kind of on the opposite side of the fence there, we have China. They didn't send their leader. I mean, he hasn't really gone anywhere during the whole pandemic, but that kind of, there's a confluence there. They're also not really increasing their ambition on climate change as much as the world had hoped. So the whole pressure here is really for countries to increase their ambition and also show how they're going to meet their goals. And the overall goal is to make sure that the temperatures don't rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. So the date is all over the place. Not everybody will commit to 2050. They do seem on side for the 1.5 degrees. And the how is also up for debate.
And when you talk about the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, that was seen as a landmark moment. But since then, there seems to be this gap between what was said then and what was promised then and what kinds of policies are happening. Do you sense that there is an urgency from nations this time to go further in cutting down emissions at COP26? Like you were saying, some of the big nations, they haven't really brought forward some of the plans in the same way. But do you sense that urgency in the room?
Absolutely. On Monday, on the first day of the conference, there were just so many passionate speeches that really had the chatter of the hallways all around here about, how moving they are and how compelling the countries are feeling about having to act. But as you say, there's a gap because, if everybody continues along the same way they are right now, I think the United Nations has calculated that the temperatures will set to warm more than 2 degrees, which is even a weaker performance than what they promised to in Paris 6 years ago. So yeah, there's an ambition gap that people are really being pushed to fill and a demand for details. And especially, you hear it echoing all over the place. You can't just have a country going out there saying, yeah, climate change bad. Let's do something about that. There's a lot of pressure, peer pressure, to say exactly what it is and how you're doing it.
Yeah, on that point too, you were talking to, of course, climate activists. Do they say that perhaps nation states can be shamed into doing something and into crafting policy out of peer pressure, international peer pressure, or perhaps shame from people outside?
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic here, actually. It feels very big and disorganized and kind of directionless sometimes because there's just so much going on, almost 200 countries and then all these other players trying to get their voices heard. But, the way that COP works is that each country puts forward its own contribution and you hope that the contributions are all going to add up to something that's, akin to keeping climate change to 1.5 degrees by 2050. But they're not really into confronting each other and saying, you've got to do more because we're not getting towards our total. It's just kind of this competition between countries to show each other up a little bit. But at the same time, the interesting dynamic really comes from the street and from the non-governmental organizations and the companies as well, that who are all having a voice in this. And they don't hesitate to point fingers, right? They are the ones who are saying, okay, you're not doing enough, or do more here or do more there.
Inside COP, there are just politicians and people in power pretending to take our future seriously, pretending to take the present seriously of the people who are being affected already today by the climate crisis. Change is not going to come from inside there. That is not leadership. This is leadership. This is what leadership looks like.
So there's kind of an underlying dialogue, I would say, with civil society.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke about Canada's commitments to get to net zero by 2050. That was on Monday. What does he say Canada will do in this fight?
So last spring, under pressure from the United States, Joe Biden had a lot of talk with Justin Trudeau about Canada's ambition, and Canada did increase its targets. So instead of promising to cut emissions by 30% by 2030, we're now promising to cut emissions by between 40 and 45%. So that's one big thing. And then how do we get there? So, over the past year, the federal government has actually put forward quite a few different things. They've increased the carbon price dramatically and set it out a very long-term plan for that price to go up and up and up. They've also put a whole bunch of money internally in Canada to keep clean energy initiatives going. And then in the election campaign, we saw a whole bunch more. We saw the federal Liberals promise to put a cap on oil and gas emissions. We saw them promise to cut fossil fuel subsidies, and we saw them promise to mandate electric vehicles across the land and also to have widespread electrification, to have a clean grid across the country. So those were election promises. And, we always take those with a grain of salt. So it was interesting this week to see Justin Trudeau come before the world stage really and say that they're going to move on the oil and gas cap right away.
We'll cap oil and gas sector emissions today and ensure they decrease tomorrow at a pace and scale needed to reach net zero by 2050. That's no small task for a major oil and gas producing country.
So that makes the promise a little bit more real. And it's a big deal when that kind of thing happens because it will put the oil sands producers under a lot of pressure to figure out either how to produce oil and gas in a much cleaner way or cut their production in order to meet the new cap.
We'll be right back. You spoke about diplomacy internationally, but also I wonder if this is a difficult case of diplomacy domestically for Trudeau too, because, he acknowledged that Canada is a resource-rich nation. There is a big oil and gas industry with lots of money and jobs to contend with. You write and report on the economics of this country. How do you think Trudeau squares almost those two competing interests?
There was an immediate backlash from Jason Kenney about moving ahead with that oil and gas cap. And, Alberta will no doubt feel the pressure. But, there has also been a lot of talk. It shouldn't be a surprise, I don't think, to anybody that Trudeau was moving in that direction. It was an election promise after all. And, the oil and gas sector is responsible for a huge portion of our emissions. And so if we're going to cut our emissions, we have to do this thing. But yeah, the problem is, so it will cut into our economy unless those companies involved in oil and gas extraction figure out a way to do this in a new way. So I think, there are two different conversations going on right now in Canada. One is, how do those companies do it? And you know what? Most of our big oil sands companies have actually committed to meeting net zero by 2050. When Trudeau goes and puts a cap on them, it'll be a timeline. You can't just wait to 2050 and do it all at once. They're going to have to do it, over time, and their feet will be held to the fire. But they're working on ways to do this, on carbon capture and storage and other ways to really cut down on how emissions are created from the production system. At the same time, it's pretty clear that, there's a people side of this. If we are switching to clean energy, and that is going to be our future. Alberta has a huge role to play in that, first of all, because they are pretty aggressive on clean energy. There's a lot of people in that province that see the writing on the wall. But it means a workforce that's going to have to change direction. And so, we talk about just transition. There's legislation to that effect that is likely to come through. There are a lot of efforts to try to figure out how to make a new workforce or how the workforce can adjust. But that's certainly going to require some work, some money, and some attention in order to make sure that people don't get hurt along the way.
Right. It's this delicate balance of how do you gradually move towards that? And it's a very difficult conversation to navigate that.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, to see Justin Trudeau here at the summit because he's actually making a virtue out of the difficulties around that whole conversation. He's out there saying, look, we have a carbon price in Canada and we're an oil producer, so we could do it. You can do it too. And yes, it wasn't easy. I had to go to the Supreme Court and I had to fight off conservatives. And he's really saying that it was all worth it in the end. And so he's inviting a whole bunch of other countries around the world to give it a try too. So really painting Canada as an example. Whereas, we used to not be an example at COPs, right? We used to win the Fossil of the Day award pretty much every day at COPs at summits past. So it's quite a change of attitude.
And I wonder, as a Canadian journalist in this international summit where you're speaking with journalists all over the world, is how Canada's seen in this conversation around climate change policy and decision making. Is there a change in how others view Canada?
Yeah, I would definitely say that Canada is not the pariah it once was, for sure. There is a little bit of skepticism from NGOs, for sure. Other countries, every country has its own issues in dealing with climate change. And there seems to be an acceptance of Justin Trudeau at face value especially on carbon pricing. There was an interesting event where Justin Trudeau appeared with the heads of a bunch of different international organizations, like heavy hitters from the IMF, from the World Trade Organization, from the World Bank, and the Prime Minister of Sweden, and Mark Carney, who's leading a big initiative on sustainable finance. And so they all got together at the invitation of Justin Trudeau to make a big push for the entire world to take on our carbon tax system. And you really can't do that kind of thing. I mean, it's a big thing to ask the world to join into. It's an interesting idea, but in order to make it work, you've got to have a lot of heft internationally. So Justin Trudeau is betting that he has that heft. We'll see probably over the coming days if people at COP actually sign on to this and say, yep, good idea, Mr. Trudeau, let's do it. Or if it's going to take years and years. I mean, sometimes these things just take forever to happen. And the thing is, on climate change, you don't want it to take forever because, as you say, it's our last best chance right now. It's not in 5 years.
Yeah, time is of the essence. There have been signposts over the decades of some of the progress that has been made in answering this existential question of climate change. We still talk about Kyoto. Paris is still at the front of mind of so many leaders at COP26. And there are, of course, competing ideas from different countries on what to do about climate change. That's why they're meeting. But how do you think some of the leaders there will want Glasgow to be remembered?
Well, I think they will certainly hope that it's a turning point in actually cutting emissions for the entire world in a big way, right? Like they will want to look back and say, okay, this conference led every country to take some serious material action and we got a handle on this thing. We've not seen that yet. Paris is known for the commitment to keep global warming under 2 degrees, but the timeline, they didn't hold each other's feet to the fire as much and we're not on track to do that. It was still significant that they actually agreed to that. But, this one is definitely about, they hope that their legacy will be, how did they actually do it? How did they actually all commit to get there? There's a pretty big problem with all of this, though. There's so much passion around cutting emissions and so much concern about the environment, but we're post-pandemic or not even, right? We're just at the tail end of the pandemic. There's outbreaks of COVID right here in the UK and in places around the world. So we've got an economy that is pretty shaky because of that. And at the same time, we've got a pretty big spike in oil and gas prices. And that's making a lot of leaders, when they're not here preaching about the environment, they're at home saying, don't worry, folks, we're going to subsidize oil and gas for you, or putting pressure on OPEC countries to increase their production of oil and gas, like the very thing that they are here promising not to do. So that's a political reality and economic reality that they're dealing with right now. And so there's, in the backs of their minds, they have this, let's create a legacy for the long term and let's certainly, care about the planet and so forth. But they've also got to balance that about how they deal with their pressures from home right now to make everyday, needs for oil and gas affordable.
In some ways, talking out both sides of their mouths, right? To look at what's going on at home and also how they are being reflected on the international stage.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible to square that circle. We see oil and gas cycles all the time. Prices go up, prices go down. Countries increase their production or they don't. But I think what it's really underlined for us is the fact that the solution here is to wait it out and wait till the prices go down. It's not to switch to clean energy, right? Which is really unfortunate. I mean, if the legacy of COP is how do you cut emissions, then you want people to be able to switch to clean energy right away. And it's pretty clear what we see from the oil and gas spike right now. We don't have those alternatives at our fingertips. We're not ready for that. So it really does underscore the need to have new options at our fingertips. It underscores the need, I think, to really, get the private sector and the clean energy sector, really get them moving with big ideas that are affordable, that can be financed, that take the world by a storm. And it actually also takes, I think, a willingness by regular people to go out there and be ready to adopt these new technologies and also change their lifestyles, right? So we're not there yet. Aspiration is one thing, but, actually changing pretty much the habits of everybody around the world is quite another.
Heather, always great to talk to you. Looking forward to your reporting.
Thanks. Take care.
And that is Heather Scoffield, the Toronto Star's Ottawa bureau chief and economics columnist, joining us from Glasgow, where COP26 will continue until November 12th. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattinen. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattinen. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.